Hello, class. This is Chapter 5, Ancient Rome and the Rise of Christianity. Please use this as a guide for your note-taking, so you'll listen, and as you're listening, please fill in your note-taking guide. Okay. The Italian peninsula is strategically placed in the middle of the Mediterranean. It has some unique features that make it really useful, that made it really good for the Romans who were conquering. First of all, it is in the center of the Mediterranean, and that made it more easily accessible with trade, and just being in a central location gave it more opportunities for domination. So it also had some mountain ranges that helped to protect it and give it a little bit more isolation from invaders. And the first is the Alps, which is up at the base of the peninsula, up on the European side, and then the Apennine mountain range that goes along the spine of the peninsula. And these two mountain ranges help to soften any blows that from invaders that may have come in. The Romans were not the first to come to the Italian peninsula. Actually, we don't really know who the first people were, but there is a lot of archaeological evidence that there was a people called the Etruscans who lived in the northern part of the Italian peninsula and along the lower coast, the west coast of the Italian peninsula. And it seems as though the Romans borrowed a lot of technology and ideas from the Etruscans. The Roman founding myth is a bit odd, actually. Well, there's a lot of versions of the founding myth, and I think part of that is because they were trying to create an identity. So one of the oldest founding myths of the city of Rome is that of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were born to their mother, who had them out of wedlock. And so because they were unwanted children, they were left out in the wild to die, which was a common practice among Romans, even later on in their history. But these two twin boys were, myth has it, that they were adopted by a wolf, a mother wolf, and nursed and reared by this wolf, and eventually grow up to found the city of Rome. And when they came of age and they were deciding what they were going to name the city, it was Romulus who won the battle and I think killed his brother and then dominated from then on. And there may be some kernels of truth in that story, but it is extremely crazy story. So, and there are some disturbing statues of that story as well. So, yes. So the Mediterranean is an important feature of the development of ancient Rome, and the Romans were not by nature seafaring people. They were land-based. Their power was land-based. So they took approximately, well, let's see, the Etruscans are supposedly between 1200 BC and 500 BC. So, but there's an overlap because the city of Rome is supposed to have been founded in 753 BC by Romulus and Remus. So it took about 200 years between 750 BC and 500 BC for the Etruscans to finally dissipate or be included into the Roman people. The Etruscans probably were politically the superiors until they threw off their Etruscan king and chose instead a republic. Okay, the Etruscans, well, it's interesting because you can go to the Italian peninsula and there are excavations scattered throughout, and these domes are actually tombs that the Etruscans made for their dead. And if you go inside these tombs, they have paintings of everyday life of the Etruscans, and you can tell that they had a happy view of the afterlife. And they would enjoy many of the same things they did in their life when they were alive. And this picture here shows a husband and wife sitting, or actually probably dining together. And if a Greek saw this picture, he would be totally shocked, because having men and women eat together would be very, very shocking. But the Etruscans were much more, I guess, liberal in that respect. And it was fine for men and women to be seen together and to have daily life together. And if you notice here, this is very common, that they made their statues and their people to be smiling, to have faces that were happy and joyful. And it says something about, probably about the culture, that it was a light and happy culture generally. So the Romans learned quite a few different things from the Etruscans. One is their writing. We can't actually understand the Etruscan writing, but the Romans borrowed their lettering from the Etruscans. So the all caps letters that you see in Latin are actually originally from the Etruscan language. And the Romans also learned how to cultivate grapes from the Etruscans, and the plow that the Romans were using, they borrowed from the Etruscans. And also working with bronze was another thing that the Romans learned from the Etruscans. All right, let's talk about the Republic. The Romans, when they were under the Etruscans, had monarchs, had kings, and it was a bit grating, and they didn't like it very much. And in 506 BC, 506 BC, they threw off their Etruscan king, his name was King Tarquin, and they decided they were going to form a republic. And this is one of the most impacting moves that they chose to make. And this republic had two basic classes. You have the patricians, who were the wealthy landowners and had most of the political power. And then you have the plebeians, who were the common people of Rome. And the plebeians had very little rights in the early republic. They couldn't vote. They could not even join the military, I think. Or they could join the military, but they couldn't choose whether they were going to war or not. So it was kind of a sticky situation for the plebeians. And if you look at the early history of the Roman Republic, the main internal conflicts were between the patricians and the plebeians, about the plebeians wanting to get more power, more voting rights, and the patricians wanting to maintain their superior status. So the way that the government was organized, if you take a look at this very simple diagram, the Senate, which was the group of patricians, would choose two consuls to run the government for a year. And these consuls had powers of leading the army and running the government and making decisions about the money and how it was going to be spent. The plebeians did not have any, at first didn't have any representation, but through several conflicts, which we will discuss later, the plebeians were given voting rights and the potential of becoming senators or even consul. But the plebeians eventually created something called the Citizens' Assembly. And from that assembly, they would choose 10 tribunes that would represent them. And basically, if they had an issue, if one of the plebeians had an issue with a patrician and was not getting justice, he could ask the tribune to take the situation, or the situation, to the Senate and to represent him to the senators and try to get justice that way. Because actually, if you look at the Roman mentality, law was very, very important, and they would be willing to follow the law if they would much rather have justice than injustice, even if it meant going above the social status that they were used to. So if you were a plebeian, you could theoretically get justice against a patrician. Well, in 741 BC, the plebeians won their right to have an assembly and to vote for a consul and to have tribunes. But the events that led up to that are rather interesting. They were facing quite a few enemies from different sides, and they were running out of fighting men, and the plebeians were decided that this was a very good opportunity to use the situation to their advantage. They had been wanting to have more voting rights, and the patricians had been blocking their every maneuver in order to get those rights. And so the plebeians told them that the patricians that they were going to go on strike. And so they refused to do anything for the patricians, and everything just basically shut down. And the patricians realized that their whole ways of life depended on the goodwill and the work of the plebeians. So it was a moment of truth, and the plebeians were able to negotiate for better voting opportunities. But the interesting thing is that the first law that they had changed was a law of marriage, because previously plebeians had not been allowed to marry into the patrician class. And the law that they changed was to allow plebeians to marry into the patrician class. So why would this be important? Because it enabled the plebeians to move up on the social ladder. They broke that glass ceiling that had kept them in their place for so long. I don't think the patricians were necessarily very happy about this, but it was a step in the direction that the plebeians were hoping for. The Romans have left a legacy for us, not only with a republic form of government, but also in technology as well. For example, concrete is one of the things that the Romans created, and it was something that enabled them to build so quickly and so lastingly. They were also extremely good engineers. This is a picture of a road called the Appian Way, and this is an example of many roads that were built during the Roman time period. They're so well constructed that they have lasted all the way until today. This is one of the interesting things about the Roman road system, is that it's curved, slightly curved, so that it leads to drainage. And if you look at a picture of a road formation, it has multiple layers, and all Roman roads have this similar structure, where it has layers of sand and gravel and finally paving stones like this, which makes it almost virtually indestructible. So some Roman roads have lasted for centuries and have been used today. If we look at the during World War II, there were several Roman bridges that were so well constructed using concrete that when the Allies landed and pushed their way up the peninsula all the way to northern Italy, they were able to go across some of these bridges with their tanks. They were so well made, and they're still standing today. So it just tells you some of the genius of the Roman engineering. Well, what kind of a course would this be without talking about women and their role in society? But if you look at the differences between how a Greek woman's experience and a Roman woman's experience, It would probably be, Roman women would have been much more like our modern experience than the Greeks. The Roman women had many more freedoms than a Greek woman. Roman women were allowed to go and have social life outside of the home. Many of them were allowed to have businesses, and they were an essential part of the Roman religious belief system. And one interesting fact is that there's a group of women who were considered to be holy if they continued to be virgins. They were called the Vestal Virgins, and they were chosen from among the patrician class, the upper class, and they were given great prestige in Roman society and often accumulated a lot of wealth because of that position. But they were chosen to maintain the fires in the temple of Jupiter that represented the eternal something of Rome. And if the fire went out, it was a bad omen. So these women had very little to do other than to tend these fires, but that was an essential part of their existence. And sometimes these women did retire and use their wealth to buy latifundia, which are large estates in the outskirts of the Roman area, of Rome. So they were well-to-do, and they had a lot of prestige in the Roman society. But as a whole, women were usually under the protectorship of one of their male relatives, either a husband or father, or sometimes under the protectorship of their son. And this was sometimes a bit scary because this protectorship or authority over a woman extended to the extent where they could lose their life if they were seen to have done something wrong. And things that would have been wrong would be adultery or impiety or any breaking a law of some kind. So the husband or the father could actually had the power of life over death for these women. Education was a huge part of Roman culture. All children should be educated in the Roman mindset. A father would be neglecting his duty to his child if he refused to educate him. So all children who were legitimate would have had an education, at least in that they would be able to read and write. They would have learned how to read and write and do basic math. But many upper-class children continued to go to school, and interestingly, what they learned after their reading and writing of Latin was reading and writing in Greek, and also learning rhetoric. And rhetoric is the art of speaking well. Anyone who aspired to a political position would have had to learn rhetoric. This is a picture of a young schoolboy who is learning his Latin, and you notice that they're using a scroll at this point. They did not use books. Both of these are students, by the way. These are two students, and this is their instructor. Oftentimes what they would do is they would buy a learned Greek slave and have him teach the heads of the household, or the future heads of the household, the boys in the school. Here's a latecomer over here. He's saying, "I'm sorry, forgive me," and he's probably going to have some kind of punishment that's not very pleasant. They had no problems with beating their children if they did something naughty at school, and even if they didn't learn their lessons well enough, they would be beaten. Oftentimes, people confuse Jupiter and Zeus and Hera and Juno and other gods and goddesses, confusing the Greek ones with the Roman ones. Well, that's understandable because the Greek gods and the Roman gods were considered interchangeable to the Roman mindset. So it's almost impossible to if you say Jupiter, people will understand that it is similar to Zeus, or it's the same god as Zeus in Greek mythology. But there were so a lot of the ideas of the stories of Zeus and Hera and other Greek gods also translated into the Latin idea of gods and goddesses. One of the genius things that the Roman Empire did was that it extended citizenship to those who it had conquered, many of those whom they had conquered, especially if they were close allies, like the ones nearest to Rome, the ones on the Italian peninsula. So peoples that were maybe not Roman in ethnicity, but were perhaps Samnite or from the area around Rome, were given citizenship, and in return they had a lot of the same duties that the Roman citizens had. For example, paying taxes, having people serve in the military, but they didn't have full citizenship in that they weren't allowed to vote for Rome's leaders or officials, but they had the right to create their own governments within their own local areas. So you have these armies that are used by Rome to create its eventual empire, and sometimes it's interesting because many historians believe that Rome accidentally acquired this empire. It wasn't as if they went out to and purposely planned to conquer the Mediterranean. In fact, in many times they tried to negotiate and avoid going to war or having to acquire any more territory, because as time went on, they realized that it brought more and more complications and difficulties. So Rome was in a very difficult situation because they didn't want to acquire any more territory, but they ended up doing just that. So they needed more soldiers, and the only way to gain more soldiers was to extend citizenship to more people, which made it that much more complicated. So Rome was growing into having a difficult situation, growing from being a republic to being an empire. One of the hallmark traits of the Roman culture is that it's a reasonable culture. They wanted to treat those that they had conquered in a reasonable and just fashion. And they were conquering a lot of different tribes, and they knew that their cultures were different and their value systems were different. And the things that they demanded of these different conquered peoples was reasonable. They simply wanted them to be loyal to the empire, to pay their taxes, and after that, they didn't mind giving them a lot of autonomy. And that as a result, the peoples that they conquered ended up being quite loyal to the Roman Empire. They appreciated the values that the Roman Empire brought to their area. And the Roman Empire gave a lot to the peoples that they conquered. The engineering that they brought with their roads and the cultural values of going to the baths and just having government that was structured in a way that gave people more justice. All these things were highly valued by the people that the Roman Empire conquered. So the conquered peoples were, in some ways, they accepted their resignation to the Roman Empire. By 270 BC, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. This was due mainly to their well-trained army. The basic military unit was the legion. Each legion included about 5,000 citizen soldiers, and as Rome occupied new territories, they treated their defeated enemies with honor. As long as the conquered peoples accepted Roman rule and obeyed certain laws, the Romans allowed them to maintain their own customs and governments.